It is one of the most iconic and tragic stories of the entire Titanic disaster. The story of the Titanic's band, who, on the night of the sinking, gave no thought of trying to save themselves, but instead decided to simply stay on the Titanic's boat deck and continue to play relaxing music while the evacuation of the ship was carried out. The reason they did this was because they were going to try to use their relaxing music to keep the crowds on the Titanic calm so there wouldn't be panic and chaos on the decks of the Titanic. After the Titanic sank at 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, the ship threw all of the members of the Titanic's band into the freezing cold North Atlantic Sea, and unfortunately not a single member of the Titanic's band would end up surviving the disaster. However, in the year 2006, a Titanic artifact was discovered that was directly linked to the story of the Titanic's band and the actions they did on the night that the ship went down. The artifact that was discovered was none other than the very own violin that belonged to the Titanic's band leader, Wallace Hartley. So now the question has to be asked, how did this violin survive the sinking of the Titanic? And why did it take until the year 2006 for this very iconic Titanic artifact to be discovered? That is what we're going to be discussing in today's video. But before we tell this story, be sure, if you haven't already, to hit that like button. If you're new here, please subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a lot. And we also have a Patreon if you would like to take a few extra steps to help support the channel. And believe it or not, guys, we also even have a Historic Travels merch store. So feel free to go and check all those things out. There are links for everything in the description below. All right, everybody. Well, hey, with that out of the way, let's now get into today's video. So I think it's important to state the obvious first. No, this violin did not go to the bottom of the ocean on board the RMS Titanic. You see, what had ended up happening was, during the final stages of the sinking of the Titanic, just as the Titanic's band was breaking up after they played their final song, Near My God to Thee, Wallace Hartley took his violin and put it in a large leather case, and then what he did was, he strapped this case to his body above his life jacket. And then, once this was done, he then headed off to try to find a way to escape the rapidly sinking Titanic. Now, unfortunately, we don't know for certain what happened to Wallace Hartley as he tried to make his escape from the rapidly sinking Titanic. That information has been lost to history. The last confirmed sighting of him was when he and his band were playing Near My God to Thee some 10 minutes before the Titanic's final plunge. However, one thing we do know for certain is that Wallace Hartley did make it off the Titanic because his body was later recovered from the Titanic's debris field. You see, on April 20th, 1912, a ship called the Mackay Bennett went to the site that the Titanic sank and began recovering all of the dead bodies that were still in the area as a result of the Titanic disaster. And Wallace Hartley's body was found in the area that the Titanic went down on that day. Now, when they recovered Wallace Hartley's body, they discovered, to their amazement, that Wallace Hartley's violin was still on his body, kept safe inside the leather case that he had secured to his body before he left the Titanic on the day that the ship went down. And where he had positioned this leather case on his body above his life jacket, the angle that the case was sitting at kept the violin more or less out of the seawater. It did make some contact with the seawater, but still, given everything that this violin went through, the violin was in remarkably good condition. So, because of this, I developed my own theory as to what I think happened to Wallace Hartley. Given the fact that the violin was still in relatively good condition, what I think happened was, I think he decided to try to swim away from the Titanic in the minutes leading up to the Titanic breaking in two. I don't think he stayed on board the Titanic until the very, very last minute. And the reason why is because of the fact that the violin is in such good condition. I honestly believe that if he had been on the Titanic after the breakup, and then given how much the water was vortexing around the ship and all the currents and pressures and everything that was going on around it, I think that if he would have been on the Titanic's stern during this moment, then all of these forces would have ripped that violin apart. I think the only reason that the violin survived and in such good condition was because he simply stepped off the Titanic's deck and swam away from the Titanic before the ship broke in two. But as I said, this is just a theory, but regardless, the violin was found on Wallace Hartley's body as they were recovering all the Titanic's victims from the debris field, and this is how the violin survived the sinking. Following the recovery of Wallace Hartley's body and the violin would eventually make its way back to Wallace Hartley's fiancée, a woman by the name of Maria Robinson. who had gifted the violin to Wallace Hartley in the year 1910 as a present to celebrate their engagement. Now, if you pay close attention to the violin, you'll discover that Mariah even put a special gift on the violin for her fiancé, Wallace Hartley. There's a plaque on the violin that says, "For Wallace, on the occasion of our engagement, from Mariah." Now, as I'm sure you all can imagine, Mariah was truly devastated by the loss of her husband on board the RMS Titanic. And when I was researching the topic for today's video, I also discovered that the two were due to be married within the next few months if Wallace Hartley hadn't died on board the Titanic. I mean, when I read that, I was just like, wow, this is truly a very heartbreaking story in regards to the Titanic. I mean, I can't even imagine how terrible this must have been for her. Now, eventually, when Mariah got the violin back, she decided to keep the violin as a memento to her late husband, and she would keep the violin in her possession throughout the rest of her life. Over the next several decades, the violin sat in Mariah's home undisturbed. However, in the year 1939, after a battle with stomach cancer, Mariah sadly passed away. After she passed away, the violin was discovered once again, located within her home in the city of Bridlington, located in England. After Mariah's death, the violin was soon discovered once again by Mariah's sister, a woman by the name of Margaret Robinson, while she was going through everything in Mariah's home. Now, upon finding the violin, it didn't take Margaret very long to make the connection between this violin and the Titanic. She knew exactly what she had here, and she also knew how massive of a historical significance this violin had. So what she decided to do was donate the violin to the Bridlington Salvation Army. She talked to the man in charge there, a man by the name of Major Renwick, and told him about the violin. Now, after this happened, the records of who owned the violin following this event are a little spotty, and I wasn't able to find any names on who owned the violin after this, but I did find a few stories. One story suggests that Major Renwick gave the violin to a local music and violin teacher. He thought that the violin's next owner should be her because he thought that she would take good care of it. However, one story suggests that she found the violin basically unplayable, but this wasn't surprising to her considering the history that this violin had. Now, another story suggests that soon that this violin teacher gave the violin to another one of her students, and that this student would have the violin for the next several decades. And then after this happened, I wasn't able to find any more history about who had the violin or where the violin went after this. However, it seems like that eventually the violin ended up in somebody's attic, where it laid forgotten until it was discovered in the year 2006. Once the violin was rediscovered in 2006, the owner of the violin apparently knew what they had, so they quickly took the violin to a Titanic auction group known as Henry Aldridge & Son. They specialize in selling Titanic artifacts. They told them what they believed they had here, and upon hearing that they thought that they had found the violin that played on the Titanic on the night that the ship sank, the auction group was obviously very skeptical. However, they spent years doing tests on the violin, and they discovered that there was some corrosion on the violin that would make sense to be there if the violin had indeed came into contact with seawater. So, after all of this research, they believed that they really did have the violin that was played by Wallace Hartley on the Titanic on the night that the ship went down. This violin eventually went up for auction, and it was sold to an anonymous buyer who paid $1.6 million for the violin. Now, Wallace Hartley's violin was sold at auction in the year 2013, and as I said, the buyer was anonymous. Now, I did do some research to try to figure out if the person who bought the violin has ever made themselves known, and do we know who owns it to this day, and as far as I can tell, they're still anonymous. No one knows who bought the violin for $1.6 million. However, I did discover one interesting thing. It seems like that whoever did end up buying Wallace Hartley's violin is, on occasion, okay with loaning the Titanic violin out, or Wallace Hartley's violin out, to several Titanic museums all over the world so the public can't see it. So, while the historian in me wishes that this violin was on permanent public display in some Titanic museum somewhere where people could go and see it whenever they want, I am happy that whoever did buy the violin is okay with letting museums borrow it on occasion so that the public can, on occasion, see the violin. Alright guys, well hey, That concludes today's video. You now know the story of Wallace Hartley's violin and how it made its way from the wreck of the Titanic to where it exists today in a private collection and sometimes Titanic museums. Anyway guys, hey, thank you all so much for watching. Be sure you leave this video a like. If you're new here, please subscribe. And thank you all so much for watching. You all are awesome. So you all take care out there, and I'll see you in the next one. Special thanks to our captain level Patreon supporter, Dakota Charbonneau. Thank you so much for all the support, man.